This is a reading from the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. People who care about whether the color that comes out on a page matches the color they see on their computer, and whether that color bears any resemblance to the real world color that occurred first. People like photographers and graphic designers and magazine editors, they use color calibrators to make sure that the red of an apple, which goes into the computer, looks like the red of the apple that turns up on the computer screen, and then looks like the red apple that comes out of the photo printer or the printing press. My color calibrator is called a spider. And even though I don't understand what the spider says to my computer, and I don't understand what my computer tells my printer this much, I do understand. Without the color calibration process that my spider is part of, all the colors of my world can be out of character and skewed. Not in reality, but in my eyes. I could tell you red and show you orange. Talk about indigo, but print Prussian blue instead. And when there is nothing to measure against, it can be quite difficult to know how far off I am. Only a very few of us have an absolute color sense that lets us look at a single color on its own and know immediately whether it is crimson or scarlet. Most of us need to check with a chart or an expert or a spider. The thing about color is, though, that it is measurable. You can measure the wavelength of the light. And even if we don't agree about the names of the colors, if object A and object B and object C all reflect the same wavelength of light, then we know they're the same color. In that sense, color contains truth with a capital T, even if we all disagree what color Prussian blue is. When I decided I needed a spider if I was going to make good photos, it was because I knew there was something real in physical, objective world that I wanted the sign world of my photograph to match. In other words, I wanted my truth to match the real truth. Matching subjective truth to objective truth is a difficult thing to talk about and even harder to do. There is an entire field of philosophy devoted to how we know what we know, not to mention a lot of research in psychology as well. And that stuff can get really technical, and most of us never really have cause to think too hard about whether when we see a table, it's actually a table, or whether it's only a table because we think it is. But even though matching inner truth to outer truth is hard to talk about and harder to do. That is exactly one of the things that we are doing in the silence of worship. We are measuring our lives against God's plumb line, and we are searching for God's plumb line everywhere. We are listening for it in the way the Spirit moves in the scripture for us. We are listening in the silence for the still small voice, which is God's whisper, trying to find God's harmony in the songs we sing. We are listening for it in all of the vocal ministry. Hearing what someone else believes the voice of God has said to them, wondering, does that sound like God's voice to me, to us? It wouldn't be so difficult to listen this way if we each had an unerring sense of the capital T truth. But we tend to have histories and personalities instead, as do those to whom we are trying to listen. That's one of the reasons why Friends believe so strongly in listening for God in community. Because when we do, we are able to let the experience and the listening spirit of the entire community help us decide where capital T truth actually lives. We use our own reason. We use the history and tradition of Friends. We use the understanding of God recorded by Jewish tradition and the Gospels and letters of the New Testament. We use all of these things in conjunction with our own experience of God within us to help us understand when we listen to a particular message, whether we are hearing Jane's personal concerns and Jane's personality, or whether we are hearing that of God within Jane speaking through her, or whether what we are hearing is some of both. I became a friend in a meeting which was offered a great deal of prophetic ministry by a few of its members. And I don't mean prophetic in the sense of predicting the future, which is never the biblical meaning of prophetic, but prophetic in the sense of calling us to shalom, calling us to live in better relationship with all of God's creation, calling us to take better care of the widow, the orphan, and the alien, calling us to live in the life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars. In that first meeting to which I belonged, some of those prophetic messages were, I think, really led by God. Some of them were led by ego or mental illness. Sometimes it was awfully hard to tell which was which. So when I went off to seminary and had time to think about it, I set myself the task of figuring out how I might tell the difference between madness and prophecy. This part is going to be familiar to those of you who are in Sunday school, but there will be an added part, I promise. Eventually, I came up with a set of 12 queries that I could ask myself as I listened to a prophetic message to help me discern how it matched up with the truth. And I'll just mention a few of those queries. Is this friend who is speaking willing to speak on behalf of the community to God, as well as on behalf of God to the community? Is this friend open to the possibility that the message might change? Would this action foster the spiritual growth of the meeting and its members? Do I feel that God is speaking to or moving in me personally through this message? What evidence does this friend give of the inward guide at work in herself or himself? Is this the cross? And is this friend prepared to bear it? That last query is perhaps a little obscure, but this is what I mean. It is one thing to express a concern about the inhumanity of slavery to both slave and owner, It is quite another thing to travel horseback across the wilderness to lovingly ask slaveholders to free their slaves. That's what John Woolman did. It is one thing to express a concern that the inequalities of the peace treaty signed at Versailles will lead to another world war. It is quite another thing to go to a broken Germany and give bread and milk to starving children. That's what the American Friends Service Committee did after the First World War. It is one thing to argue with words and books about who Jesus was and what his life meant, and another thing to move from Germany to the banks of the Ogui River in equatorial Africa and to build there a hospital and a leper colony. That's what Albert Schweitzer did when he said he had decided to make his life his argument. So what I mean by my query, is this the cross and is this friend prepared to bear it, is that I have learned not to be nearly as impressed by a prophet's concern for what I ought to do as I am by their own commitment to undertake the work of which they speak. I remember a particular example of this from my time at Cincinnati Friends. I think this was probably around 2006. In the silence of worship one day, one member stood up to talk about how he felt especially convicted by two verses from the first chapter of Isaiah. Stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. At that time, one of our study groups that we had at the meeting was studying about Afghanistan. And those verses really struck him because of what he'd been learning about Afghanistan. And as he thought about how we could encourage the oppressed in Afghanistan, he wondered whether we couldn't help the American Friends Service Committee build the most extravagant item on their Afghanistan wish list. He wondered why it wouldn't be possible for us to raise $36,000 to build a 10-room school for Afghan children. And in the silence that followed his words, I could feel internal truth and God's truth being calibrated. Why couldn't we raise $36,000 to build a school in Afghanistan? Why wouldn't it be possible? Consider that this was a meeting in Cincinnati where people earn a relatively good living. It was a meeting which at that time had about 70 to 75 members. It might be possible. So that was the prophetic message that I heard and that everyone who was in meeting for worship that day heard. But then there was another message that followed that only a few people heard, and I was privileged to be one of them. At Cincinnati Friends at that time, most of the children spent 15 minutes in worship and then went to first day school. But some of the kids didn't want to go to first day school and wanted to stay with their parents. And on this particular day, we had a child who was about 6 or 7 years old who stayed with us for worship and who heard this message. She heard this guy talk about the possibility of raising money for an orphanage. She wasn't 7 quite yet, so as with any of our children, when they stay in for meeting, or any children here, it's hard to know what they actually hear, what they pay attention to, what sense they make of the message. But after meeting, I found her envelope among others in the collections plate. She had taken one of our offering envelopes and written at the top of it, "For Afghan school." She had put in $1. And at the bottom of the envelope, she wrote, "I care for you, child." She became one of the strongest examples I've ever seen of someone who understands how to listen to prophetic ministry. This is what she did. She listened seriously to the messages that were spoken. She matched them up with that of God in her own heart. She believed the speakers because she had always known them to be people who not only asked others to do something, but who did things themselves. She felt God's motion of love inside herself, asking her to do something. And she was faithful to that motion of love. Her dollar in the collection plate, her care for the children of Afghanistan, that was also an actual prophetic message, and one that recalibrated my own vision. I chose to begin with those verses from 1 Corinthians 13 because they seem to address the dimness of our present vision, the difficulty we always have in finding and living the truth. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. In our dimness, Paul seems to say, we have three aids to discernment: faith, hope, and love, and any true word about God's kingdom will have to contain these elements, of which love is the greatest. We think of prophets as preaching doom and destruction, but for all the true prophets, a passionate love for those who suffer, both the wronged and the wrongdoers, runs beneath and upholds their prophetic indictments. And sometimes there is no indictment at all, only the motion and the action of love. That was the unspoken prophecy of the child in worship who put her dollar in a collection envelope for a child in Afghanistan. An unspoken prophecy, but one that was lived out, a motion purely of love. A motion of love, but like John Woolman's motion, a challenge nonetheless. And it still challenges me to think that a 7-year-old girl with no resources to speak of could respond to the need for a school for children in Afghanistan before I myself was able to respond. But I can say that her prophecy, motivated by love, was one to which I listened.